I've compared AMD's last 3 generations of 16-core Ryzen processors in games and applications to find out if it's time to upgrade, or if you can save some money getting an older model. All 3 of these Ryzen 9 processors are 16-core 32-thread chips, but the newer the CPU, the higher the clock speed they reach. The 5950X only boosts 200 MHz higher than the 3950X, while the new 7950X boosts 800 MHz higher than the 5950X, and the 7950X also has double the L2 cache. AMD's new Zen 4 processors now use the newer DDR5 memory, and they've also got integrated graphics now, something the older parts don't have. At the time of launching in September 2022, AMD plans to sell the 7950X for $700 US. Right now on Newegg, you can pick up the older 5950X for $550 or the 3950X for $495. This will change over time, so check current prices with the links below the video. So with a $150 higher price tag, it begs the question, is the 7950X worth paying more for compared to AMD's older and cheaper 16-core CPUs? To find out, I've used this system to compare all 3 processors. I've tested with MSI's Core Liquid S360 AIO and Noctua NT-H2 thermal paste so we can fairly compare thermals. But the motherboard and RAM have been changed for the 7950X, as this uses the new AM5 socket and requires DDR5 memory. Alright, let's get straight into some application, thermal, and power draw tests. And then after that, we'll check out performance in 12 games at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K resolutions. Let's start out with Cinebench R23, as it's an easy way to get a general idea of where single and multi-threaded performance are at. I've got the oldest 3950X down the bottom, the 5950X in the middle, and the newest 7950X at the top. And we can clearly see that the new Zen 4 based 7950X is giving us a big performance boost compared to the last 2 generations. We're talking about a 51% higher single-core score compared to the 3950X, and a 25% lead over the 5950X. The multi-core gains were more impressive, with the 7950X scoring 49% better than the 5950X, despite both processors having the same core and thread count. So what's going on? We can see why the boost is so large when checking out the clock speeds being reached during this test. Before the 7950X, 16-core Ryzen chips were maxing out at 3.9 GHz in this all-core workload. The up to 4.7 GHz listed on the spec sheet for the 3950X and 4.9 GHz for the 5950X apply to single-core boost, so lower speed with all cores under load is expected. The 7950X, on the other hand, is smashing well beyond the 5 GHz barrier in a sustained manner. Impressive stuff. At least until we take a closer look under the hood. The 7950X is using significantly more power compared to the other 2 processors in order to reach these speeds. Yeah, the 7950X is scoring 49% better in multi-core compared to the 5950X, but it's also using 69% more power to achieve this. Not so nice in this case. Seems like AMD might have taken a page out of Intel's book. The 7950X ends up similar to the 3950X from an efficiency perspective, while the 5950X was the most efficient, at least in this specific test with no power limits. We could of course use eco mode on the 7950X to limit it to use less power, but we're testing at default here as I figured most people buying these high-end CPUs will do the same. More power generally equals more heat, and the 7950X was reaching TJ max at 95 degrees Celsius in this test, even with my large 360 all-in-one liquid cooler. Now, AMD notes that with the new AM5 socket and higher TDP, 95 degrees Celsius is expected when under heavy multi-core load, and this is intended and by design. They go on to note that TJ max is the maximum safe operating temperature, not the absolute max. The processor is designed to run at 95 degrees Celsius like this 24/7 without risk of damage or deterioration. So basically, AMD don't consider 95 degrees Celsius as hot. Zen 4 will intentionally try to go to this temperature as much as possible to squeeze out as much performance as it can. Personally, I don't really see this as much of an issue, but I'm used to testing laptops, so 95 degrees Celsius is pretty standard stuff. It seems like you'll want a good cooler to pair with the 7950X in order to get the most out of it. Alright, just before we get into the game benchmarks, let's look at the rest of the productivity workloads, as this is honestly what 16-core processors are designed for. Blender was tested with the OpenData benchmark, and I've included all three different workloads that it tests. The 7950X had a 57% lead over the older 3950X in the classroom test, and still a 52% lead when compared to the 5950X. The differences between the 3950X and 5950X look super small compared to what the 7950X is capable of. The V-Ray benchmark is another heavy multi-threaded rendering workload, and the 7950X has its biggest lead over the 3950X here, scoring 75% higher. The 7950X comes out 49% ahead of the 5950X, so still a great single-generation performance boost. But again, don't forget about the extra power needed to pull this off. The Corona benchmark also uses the processor to render out a scene, but lower times are better now. This workload had one of the smallest differences out of all applications tested, with the 7950X being 24% faster than the 5950X. Linux kernel compilation was tested in Linux with Ubuntu 22.04, whereas the rest of the tests were all done with Windows 11. There's not much difference between the 3950X and 5950X here, which I suspect is due to them having the same amounts of L2 and L3 cache. Cache affects compilation performance, and the 7950X with its double L2 cache is 30% faster than the 5950X. LLVM compilation is the only other test I've done in Linux, and again the 5950X and 3950X were much the same here. The 7950X was around 30% faster compared to the 5950X just below it here too. Handbrake was used to convert my 4K 60fps review video of the Legion 7i gaming laptop to 1080p H.265. Lower times are better here, and again the gap between the 3950X and 5950X is much smaller compared to the bigger lead by the newer 7950X. The 7950X was 31% faster than the 5950X and 36% faster than the 3950X. This test can leverage AVX512 with an optional flag enabled, as the 7950X adds hardware support for it, but I only found this to maybe give it a 10-second speed up. Adobe Premiere was tested with the Puget Systems benchmark tool, and this tests video editing tasks like exporting, playback, and more. Again, only minor differences between the older 3950X and 5950X, with the 7950X having the larger lead. Don't forget the 7950X adds integrated graphics for the first time now, so this could in part be responsible for some of the performance uplift here, as Premiere can leverage integrated graphics. DaVinci Resolve is another video editing program, and the performance gap was a little larger here, with the 7950X scoring 24% higher compared to the last-gen 5950X, and 33% higher compared to the 3950X before that. Adobe Photoshop does better with more single-threaded performance, and as we saw in Cinebench earlier, the 7950X certainly has some nice gains there. It's scoring 29% ahead of the 5950X, but 47% ahead of the older 3950X. Now for some office tasks like Microsoft Excel, Word, PowerPoint, and Outlook. The 7950X was ahead in all workloads, so I guess consider upgrading if you're doing serious office business. 7-zip was used to test compression and decompression. Ryzen generally does much better compared to Intel in these tests, and I really can't wait to compare the 7950X against Intel's 13th gen Core i9-13900K soon once it's available. Make sure you're subscribed for that comparison. Again, like many other workloads tested, the gap between the 3950X and 5950X is smaller compared to where the 7950X takes us. GeekBench tests a bunch of various workloads, some of which benefit from AVX512 instructions, which is something that the 7950X has hardware support for and explains the above-average gains. The 7950X was scoring 51% higher compared to the 5950X in the multi-core test. The second biggest difference out of all workloads I've tested. On average, out of all applications tested, the new 7950X is around 47% faster when compared to the older 3950X. Though, as we can see, there are significant differences between the various applications. For example, V-Ray was scoring 75% higher with the 7950X, while Adobe Premiere had a smaller 26% boost. If we instead compare the 7950X against the 5950X, then we're looking at a 31% improvement with the newest 7950X in these same specific application tests. Again, it really depends on the specific workload. Blender could be 50% better on the 7950X, while Microsoft Word had basically no change. I guess even the 7950X can only do so much clip art. Alright, now let's compare some games. I've tested all three processors in 12 different games at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K resolutions to see what the differences are. Let's start out with Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered. I've got the 1080p results down the bottom, 1440p in the middle, and 4K up the top, with the older CPUs below the newer ones within each resolution. At 1080p, the 7950X was coming out 55% ahead of the older 3950X in average FPS, and 28% ahead compared to the 5950X. The gaps are a bit lower at the higher 1440p resolution, but there's still a clear lead with the 7950X. By the time we get to the highest 4K resolution though, the differences between the 7950X and 5950X are basically nothing as we're GPU bound now, and those only had a small 7% boost over the 3950X. Microsoft Flight Simulator was tested in the Sydney Landing Challenge, and it was sort of similar in regards to the 5950X and 7950X not having a real measurable difference at the highest 4K resolution. The gaps are bigger at 1440p and 1080p, where the CPU difference matters more. At 1440p, we're talking about a nice 46% boost with the 7950X compared to the older 3950X, though only a 17% lead when compared to the 5950X. WARHAMMER III was tested with the game's benchmark tool, and had no difference at all between the three processors at 4K. Even 1440p showed no differences between the 7950X and 5950X, with the 3950X just 11 FPS or so behind. At 1080p, the 7950X was 49% ahead compared to the 3950X, a fairly big lead. But at the same time, the 5950X was already providing most of the gains, as the 7950X is only 3% faster than the 5950X. Halo Infinite also saw no change between all three CPUs at 4K, as well as no changes between the 5950X and 7950X at 1440p. The biggest differences were seen at 1080p, where the 7950X was 42% faster compared to the older 3950X, and just 16% ahead of the 5950X, or less than a 20 FPS boost. Things start looking a little weird in Call of Duty Warzone. Not only are the differences between all three processors far smaller at all three resolutions, but the 5950X was a little ahead at 1080p. I'm not too sure what the deal is here, but I found a similar pattern in my comparison between the 7700X and 5700X as well. Basically, it just doesn't seem to matter which CPU you pick for this one. Speaking of weird results, something similar was seen in Apex Legends. And yes, I've got the frame cap removed. This time the 5950X was a little behind the older 3950X at 1080p and 1440p, and the 7950X was only able to clearly start beating the 3950X at the highest 4K resolution, which is the opposite compared to what we've seen in all other games. Again though, I also saw something similar happening in this game when comparing the 3700X, 5700X, and 7700X. Fortnite had fewer issues. Technically, the 1% lows were slightly higher on the 5950X compared to the 7950X for some reason, but otherwise the 7950X was always the winner when it came to average frame rates. Like some of the other games though, the 7950X wasn't actually that far ahead of the 5950X here, while both have nice improvements over the older 3950X. While we're on the subject of esports games, CSGO was seeing some of the biggest boosts with the newest CPUs out of all 12 games tested. The 7950X was reaching a 74% higher average FPS compared to the 3950X at 1080p, and although it's then 19% ahead of the 5950X, because we're hitting such high frame rates here, this still means more than 70 FPS extra. This game also had the biggest improvements with newer processors at 4K, as it just doesn't seem to get GPU limited. Basically, it just cares about CPU power more compared to most other games. Cyberpunk 2077, on the other hand, had no differences at 4K or 1440p as we're hitting GPU limits, at least with high settings with my RTX 3090 Ti. Maybe this will be a different story once the RTX 4090 comes out. I'll be comparing those soon, so make sure you're subscribed. Anyway, again, like some of the other games, the 7950X only had a small 3% boost to average FPS compared to the 5950X, but it was 24% ahead of the older 3950X. Red Dead Redemption 2 was tested with the game's benchmark and had a bit more of a difference at 1440p this time, but once more, the 5950X and 7950X really aren't too different at all, and all three processors saw no difference at 4K. The 7950X was 38% faster than the 3950X at 1080p, and 12% faster compared to the 5950X. Not exactly a change that makes you want to run out and upgrade to AM5. I've tested the Riftbreaker using the CPU benchmark option, and there was a bit more of a difference between the three processors at 4K now, at least compared to most other games tested. Granted, the gaps at 1440p and 1080p are bigger for reasons we've discussed. Last game before we get into the fun comparison graphs. Watch Dogs Legion was tested with the game's benchmark, and like most others, there weren't any differences at 4K. The 7950X was 23% faster than the 5950X at 1080p, and 45% ahead compared to the older 3950X. On average, over all 12 games tested, at 1080p, the new 7950X was performing 40% better than the older 3950X. As we can see here, the differences really depend on the specific game. CSGO at the top, for example, is 74% faster with the 7950X, while games like Warzone and Apex, on the other hand, had no difference at all. If we instead compare the 7950X to the 5950X at 1080p, then we're looking at the 7950X coming out 13% ahead. Much less of a difference. The gap between these two just isn't as big, as the 5950X was already doing much better compared to the 3950X, stepping up to the higher 1440p resolution, and the 7950X is now 28% faster compared to the 3950X, versus the 40% boost we saw at the lower 1080p resolution. Higher resolutions usually need more GPU power to run, which is why we're looking at a smaller gap now. This isn't the case for all games though, which is why CSGO was still 73% ahead on the newest 7950X at 1440p. The 7950X was about 9% faster than the 5950X on average at 1440p, so again a much smaller gap with more than half our games seeing less than a 5% improvement. Nothing really significant. CPU differences usually matter the least at 4K, as most games rely on the GPU more than the CPU. Again, CSGO is the outlier at the top, where the 7950X actually still gives us 66% better performance compared to the 3950X. And then when comparing the 7950X against the 5950X, well, we're talking about just a 2.5% improvement on average in favor of the 7950X. Basically nothing. Here's what we're looking at when we take the average frame rates from all 12 games tested to try and spot some overall trends. The 7950X is definitely giving us a boost over the 5950X, particularly at 1440p and 1080p. It's just not quite as big percentage-wise compared to going from the 3950X to 5950X. Despite the 7950X offering the best raw gaming performance, it's not the best value option for gaming due to its higher cost. AMD are launching it for $700 US, so it's going to be hard for it to compete against the 5950X when you can pick that up for $150 less. Though this is only factoring in CPU costs, not motherboards or DDR5 memory. Though to be fair, DDR5 prices have come down quite a bit over the last year. The prices I've got for the older CPUs are the lowest at Newegg when I'm making this video in late September. But again, use the links below the video to check current prices. It's a bit of a different story outside of gaming though. In Cinebench R23, the 7950X gives you the best bang for buck, at least based on current prices today. Of course, no one is out here here buying a $700 processor to run Cinebench, but this shows that it's offering better value if you need multi-core performance despite costing more. And really, it's these sorts of workloads that the 7950X is designed to run, rather than being gaming focused. Don't get me wrong, the 7950X is certainly a capable option when it comes to gaming, but from my testing so far, it seems like it's pretty close to the much cheaper Ryzen 7 7700X, if not slightly behind. So something like that would just make more sense if you're building a gaming focused system. And let's not forget, if you've got a 3950X, then you can take it out and do a drop-in replacement to the 5950X without changing any hardware. So if you've already got a 3950X setup, then that will be a much cheaper upgrade path compared to going to the 7950X and getting new memory and motherboard. And if you are gaming, as we've just seen, that simple change of going from the 3950X to 5950X will give you most of the gains compared to spending more on the 7950X. At least in games. If time is money and you need the best productivity performance in applications, then the 7950X does start making more sense. As upgrading from the 3950X to 5950X in many of those multi-core tests just wasn't as big of a gain compared to going to the 7950X. Of course, you would have to buy DDR5 memory and a new motherboard, but you could still get some money back selling your older stuff. If you've got the budget for a brand new PC today, honestly, if you know that you need 16 cores to get your work done, the 7950X offers excellent performance boosts compared to AMD's older 16-core offerings. Just make sure you pair it with a good cooler to get the most out of it. AMD is of course by no means the only CPU maker around. Intel's 13th gen processors will be here very soon, so make sure you're subscribed for my upcoming comparison between the Intel 13900K and 7950X. We're going to find out who has the best CPU in that video.